Folks, I want to welcome our guest to the show. It is Thomas Steenburg. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hello, Brian. How are you today?
I am fantastic. I have been so excited about this conversation. I'm glad today is finally here. So let's get right into it. Some people may not know who you are and what got you into this Bigfoot thing. So why don't we start there? Let's talk a little bit about what got you interested in this subject and has kept your imagination going for these many decades that you've been looking into it.
Oh, hell, I've been fascinated with the subject of the Sasquatch ever since I was old enough to read. I still remember my father telling my mother, "Don't worry, he'll grow out of it," but it never seemed to happen. It all started for me back in the mid-1960s when my parents brought home a hardcover Reader's Digest book for education purpose for my sister and myself. She's 2 years younger than I am. And, in this old hardcover book, they had chapters and on everything you could think of: volcanoes, hurricanes, this, that, blah, 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 anything to do with nature. And of course, as usual, they had a great big section on the age of the dinosaurs with the old beautiful colored paintings of T-Rex standing straight up and dragging his tail on the ground and stuff that they know wasn't true now. And right in the middle of that was a little 2-page article called "The Thing in Loch Ness" with the usual 3 blurry pictures. And I don't know, switch seemed to click, and I must have read that 100 times. Started bugging my parents for information, and they eventually gave me a library card, said, "Go off and find out about yourself, kid." And I did. And I'm trying to find out, and I knew very young age I wasn't going to move to Scotland. So, and then kind of started reading about this thing in Western Canada called the Sasquatch. In the United States, they called it Bigfoot. But I think what really did it was one night when I should have been in bed, I came down home and went to the living room. My parents were watching a movie in the old black and white TV. Father said something on the area of, "Oh, let's let the lad watch this. He's interested," this kind of thing. I said, "Oh, no, we can't watch this. I'll have bad dreams," there. But he won that argument, and I'm sure he's regretted that ever since. And what was playing was that old Peter Cushing Hammer horror film, The Abominable Snowman in the Himalayas, with Sasquatch from that day on.
Well, I know one of the things that I have so respect about you over the years, among many, is your historical sort of foundation in the Bigfoot thing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the history that you've looked into during your research and some of the Native American First Nations peoples' accounts of these things. What have you found over the course of your many decades looking into the history of these things that is based in the Native American and First Nations people?
Well, the first thing I discovered, and I discovered rather early, especially here on the west coast of Canada, when you're dealing with First Nations, the first thing you do if you're dealing with any First Nations, don't mention any other First Nation, because the odds are they don't like each other. And when they hear you're talking to other groups, they tend to clam up on you. But right just 30 minutes from my door is the Stehalis Reserve, on the Harrison River, on the south end of Harrison Lake. That's where the name Sasquatch was first coined. You know the story. A man named J.W. Burns was an Indian agent. Put it politely, he was a spy for the crown, but he was very sympathetic and was well liked by the people in the Stehalis Reserve. And they eventually trusted him, and they told him about their oral history, and they started talking about this creature in the woods around them that they called the Sasquatch. It all depends who you talk to how to pronounce it. The best way to think of it is take the word basket, drop the B, and add SAS to it. And he wrote articles. It got published in Canadian magazines. And he wrote an article that was published on April Fool's Day, 1929, entitled "Introducing BC's Hairy Giants." And he took their name, Sasquatch, and he misspelled and mispronounced it. They called it Sasquatch. And it's been known as Sasquatch in Canada ever since.
You also got to spend some time with what most people call the 4 horsemen of Sasquatchery. And I'm always interested in a lot of shows about them because they're basically all gone. I've had Peter Byrne on the show, and Peter's getting up there. I mean, he's in his early 90s now. So you got to spend time with all 4 of these people, and you got to see their personalities up close, and you got to see the way that they approach the subject. Talk a little bit about your experiences with those 4 individuals and what stuck out to you over those many years of dealing with those different personalities.
Well, the biggest thing about them is they dealing with, the late Rene Dahinden, the late John Green, the late Grover Krantz, and Peter Byrne. Peter Byrne to the less extent. I really didn't meet him face to face till 2010. But I knew Rene and John and most of the others, and did a lot of work with all of them. And one of my achievements, I like to say, I got to be friends and colleagues with all these fellows, and I never got sucked into personal wars. Because believe me, half the time you couldn't get these guys in the same room together. You know, Granny would say, "So what does that technique think about this or that?" And I said, "I'm not telling you, Rene. I won't tell you what he said. I won't tell him what you said." He didn't like it, but he accepted it. He never held it against me, and he held it against so many others. But it was incredible. But what really impressed me about these four guys is they were all zoological, which is what I am. If the Sasquatch does indeed exist, it's probably a primate, an unclassified species of primate, higher primate, nothing more, nothing less. So I'm not into the paranormal explanation a lot of people jump into and things like that. But dealing with the old guard, as you call them, I guess people call me one of the last ones now, and I was the young guy back in those days. It was a hell of an experience and a lot of fun. I missed them all greatly. I was great friends with all of them. The late Grover Krantz, the late John Green, the late Rene Dahinden, the late Bob Titmus, the late Vladimir Markotic. Vladimir really took me under his wing when I started. He was working at the University of Calgary. He just contacted me and said, "Hey, Tom, come. This is Vladimir." He was Croatian, right? And I go talk to him at the Earth Science building at the University of Calgary, and he did the academic stuff, and I did the field research for him, and that's how I got started.
Let's talk a little bit about the research part of it. Is there anything that has stuck out to you over the years that was just sort of, I don't want to say indisputable, because I don't think anything really is when it comes to Bigfoot, but anything that's really stuck out to you over the years that has, in your mind, come closer maybe than other things to proving their existence?
Well, interviewing witnesses, other than some of the footprints I've looked into and stuff, and all the years I've been looking, I may have only had a fleeting glimpse of the creature itself once, and I won't even say it was a Sasquatch because it was just too far away to positively identify. But the most incredible thing is talking to some of these witnesses who wish to remain anonymous. I really see no reason for them to make up such a story, and it's the ones I can't find an alternate explanation for that has kept me intrigued all these years. I mean, when you're dealing with an alleged witness, you always got to remember there's only three possibilities. Only three. One, they saw a Sasquatch. Two, they mistook someone or something for a Sasquatch. Or three, they're lying. Okay. And I've interviewed so many people now and the ones that fascinate me is the ones they don't seem to have any point or anything to gain to make up such a story. And I can't find an alternative explanation other than they saw what they claim to have seen or what they believe to have seen. And some of them don't even believe it themselves. That has always intrigued me. I mean, if the Sasquatch mystery were a criminal investigation, we would have had a conviction a long time ago. Well, but it's not, and we can't accept that because eyewitness testimony is considered soft evidence. The Sasquatch mystery will be solved when science gets what science has always demanded. And that is a body or piece of the body, and no amount of politically correct wishful thinking is ever going to change that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I
Yeah,
totally agree.
yeah.
So you mentioned it briefly. Let's talk a little bit about your possible sighting back in 04. Tell us a little bit about what happened there. What was the circumstances and what did you see?
Well, I was heading up the west side of Harrison Lake in 04. I wasn't really on a research trip this time. A buddy of mine named John Miles, he's sort of the caretaker up there at the 20-mile bay, and he said a number of incidents happened to him over the years. I was just taking him home, and we were coming up over the bend there about 20, or near down the entrance to where Mystery Valley begins, and I saw this figure on a cut line almost a mile away, you know, where the big power lines go through from the center cut line, walking towards the trees on the right-hand side. I barely had time to bring my Land Rover to a stop, grab the camera, get out the door, and start taking pictures of it. And by the time I got the camera up, it was gone. All I did was looked at John and said, "You see that?" And he said, "Yes, I did." What I saw was a jet black figure that appeared to be walking upright, but it was too far away to see detail. So it was either a biggest, oddest man that you could ever imagine, or it was a Sasquatch, one or the other. But my philosophy has always been stick to the facts and never deviate from the facts. I saw a figure. It was jet black in color and appeared to be walking upright. But the facts also are it was too far away to see details. So I cannot say with 100% certainty it wasn't a big, odd man way up there. So if that was the Sasquatch I've seen, it was a man I still have not. But the way I remember this, that figure was big, even for a Sasquatch. I think if I put a 7-foot guy up there and went back to my vantage point, I would barely see him at all.
Yeah, I've interviewed so many people who have had encounters. And the one thing I always say about my show, out of the hundreds of people I've had on already, I don't ever have anybody on my show that I don't believes that they saw what they say they saw, right? And people get on to me all the time. You know, I have the haters out there on the online thing, you know, these keyboard folks that get behind the keyboard and talk trash to people online. And it's always about, did you vet this person? How did you go about vetting their story? Well, you know, I vetted it as well as I could from 1968 when they had this encounter, and it's now 2022 is always my answer to that question. I'm not an investigator. I used to be a cop, but I'm not anymore. So people who share their stories on the show, I leave it at face value, right? Because these anecdotal stories, in my opinion, are one of the reasons that I do these shows is to gather as much evidence as we can, because I think the anecdotal evidence in these encounter stories help look at behaviors and things that happen on the West Coast versus the East Coast and literally around the world. But one of the things you have to be careful of, I think, and I've heard you talk about this a little bit in the past, is, you know, to have one experience with these creatures. You've been doing this for many decades, and you have what could be a fleeting moment where you might have seen one. And then you have these people who see them 6 times in 3 years, and they have these habituation sites. Have you come across that in your research? And how do you feel about people who have had these multiple encounters over many years and sometimes in very short periods of time?
Well, my personal opinion, I'm only expressing my own opinion. I'm an investigator. So a lot of people like to use the word researcher. I prefer investigator. We're trying to find an answer to a mystery. We are not religious leaders pushing a faith. So yes, I do vent witnesses. And if I think they're either mistaken, I'll tell them. And if I think they're lying, I'll tell them. Or I just politely say, thank you very much, and they never hear from me again. Right? And whether you want to admit it or not, now in your position, doing a blog talk show, you have to listen to all of these and take them all at face value. I don't. I investigate. And I want to know if this person actually saw what they think they saw, or they're making it up, or they could be mistaken. Because let's face it, if the Sasquatch does indeed exist, it's a good bet a good number of these witnesses actually saw what they claim to have seen. If it doesn't exist, none of them have. It's all mistaken identity or lying.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that when I had Les Stroud on the show, that's one of the things towards the end of the interview that Les said, you know, if you can't look at somebody and tell them to their face that they're a liar, and they didn't have a misidentification because they've been in the woods, they're a hunter, they know the area, they know the wildlife, then you're only left with really one thing, and that is the third option, that what they did see was in fact a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. So I kind of go into it with that, but I do, you know, sometimes the BS meter goes off and the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my spidey sense goes off and my cop brain turns on. And I think, you know, people on the show that I've had may be embellishing some. The majority, I have to say, I believe. So let's talk a little bit about what you think about. We get literally hundreds, probably thousands of reports a year. I think it has slowed down a little bit. And maybe that's something you can talk about over the last couple of years. Are you seeing a spike in sightings? Or are you seeing them go down? But overall, out of all of these many, many accounts that you've personally looked into, how many of them do you think are bogus and how many of them do you think are real?
Well, in my personal opinion, the ones I bother to make a file on, I generally tend to accept could be a possibility. Usually, the ones that I'm convinced they're just making it up or hoaxing or attempting to hoax or looking for their 15 minutes of fame. I don't bother making anything on it. I should have. They'd make an interesting book on their own. But the Sasquatch mystery is as interesting it is as a cryptozoological enigma and mystery to be solved. It's also a great study into human nature. I mean, let's face it, we used to call these things old wives' tales, urban legends or woodland legends, things like that. People love to tell stories, and that's just a simple fact. There are always people out there with motives. Either they just want their 15 minutes or whatever, and they make things up. I think there are a lot of people out there who make things up just because they want to see if they can fool you. And I'm not naive to think that I have never been fooled. If there is no Sasquatch, never was, a lot of people have fooled me. Let's face it. But that's what it comes down to. Does the thing exist? But it's a fascinating study in human nature. And human nature is, quite frankly, let's face it, full of BS. There is a lot of BS out there, and a lot of people make things up. And the Sasquatch mystery over the last few decades has become too boring for a lot of people. So they've gone off into other things. Shadow people, dog men. I mean, before that, Linda Godfrey wrote that excellent book, The Beast of Bray Road. I never heard of a single dogman encounter. Now they're all over the place. But I have none before that. None. And so it's kind of shows how a trend starts and it grows. And matter of fact, and simple fact, one of the best tools we have is one of the worst things that ever happened to this research: the invention of the internet. Great tool it is. Let's face it, it's a soapbox for every snake oil salesman out there. And if you do your homework and don't overdo it, which is the biggest mistake most hoaxers do, they can't stop themselves. And they make it just sound too incredible. And like I said, a big red flag for me is someone who claims multiple sightings but can never back it up but take my word for it. And then they say, well, I didn't take any pictures because I don't want people out there on blah, blah, blah. I said, then why are you even telling us about it? Why are you even telling us about it? Yeah, let's face the fact. Human nature is human nature. People lie. People make things up. People make mistakes. And a lot of people tell the truth.
Well, let's talk a little bit about a couple of different things I want to get into. I want to talk a little bit about Ruby Creek because I've heard you talk about Ruby Creek in the past. And it's one of those stories that's always fascinated me, but I know you're sort of the authority on that. You're kind of like the Mark Marcel of the Ruby Creek, like versus Ape Canyon kind of thing. So for the audience who may not be familiar with the Ruby Creek story, would you talk a little bit about that incident and what took place during that?
Well, it's one of our Western Canadian classic tales. Everywhere we have classic tales. The Chapman incident of September 1941 is one of those classic tales. You can't pick up the older books always cover these. The early books by Sanders and John Green and stuff always covered the Chapman incident of 1941. What happened was Miss Jenny Chapman lived in a small cabin just beyond Ruby Creek on the banks of the Fraser River. And when she was doing dishes, one of her three children came into the house and said, Mommy, there's a strange cow coming out of the woods. And she went and had a look. She didn't see a strange cow coming out of the woods. She saw a hair-covered human-like figure with black skin, rather teak color in hair. She described it as rather like an oar for a boat, coming out of the tree line, walking across the field towards the house. And she basically panicked, and she got a blanket and she covered the kids up, went out the back door down to the bank of the river, down along the trail that went through the cemetery up to the railway tracks and went running down the railway tracks. Several men who were working on the railway tracks, workers, saw her running towards them saying, "The Sasquatch is after me." So they went and they took a look. They never saw the animal, but they did see its tracks, and they did see where it walked through a potato patch and crushed some of the potatoes that were in her potato patch there. And the track seemed to circle the house, went to a lean-to beside the house, tore open a barrel of salted salmon. They guessed that it may have sampled the salmon, didn't like the salted taste, and scattered the contents of this salted barrel all over the place, and then went off towards the river. Again, they guessed to wash the bad salt taste out of its mouth, and then the line of tracks went straight back, across the same field, over the CPR line. The Lougheed Highway that runs there today wasn't there in 1941. It was just the railway, and it disappeared into the mountains. And this got a lot of attention, the press at the time. And a retired deputy sheriff from the United States in Bellingham named Joseph Dunn heard about it. I have his letters here. And he came up to do an investigation. And he actually cast one of the tracks. And why this man was even interested in this subject, I mean, this would make him, he would predate Rene, John, and everybody else for that matter. Why he was even interested in the first place, we'll never know, because he died in 1948. And his family kept the casting as a door stopper that for about a couple of decades to have broken. They threw it away. It's really too bad. But the Chapman incident, if you read some of the original accounts, they give you the impression that after this happened, the Chapmans abandoned the house. That's not quite true. They did stay another week. But whatever it was, they thought kept coming back, even though they didn't see it again. But every time, morning around 3 a.m., their dog would go crazy at something was circling, and they would hear this loud, piercing crying noise from outside. After a week of that, Mrs. Chapman had had enough, and she and her family abandoned the house. But other relatives moved in, continued to use the house until the last big flood of the Fraser River in 1948, when this whole property was about 4.5 feet underwater. That caused the house to be abandoned eventually, and was left to the elements until John Green and Rene investigated the story in 1957. 13 years after it actually occurred. And of course, John included in his book, and Ivan T. Sanderson managed to interview Mrs. Chapman and George just a week or so before they were tragically drowned in a boating accident on the Fraser River. And John Green also managed to interview them too. And it's known as the Chapman incident, and it's one of our classic tales.
You mentioned Rene Dahinden again. So I want to talk a little bit about, I know I'm all over the place because there's so many things I want to ask you. So let's talk a little bit about Rene Dahinden. He was one of the four horsemen. Obviously, he did a lot of research. He was boots on the ground. And as far as I know, I think he was probably one of the more skeptical of the bunch about the whole thing, Bigfoot. What was his involvement with the Bossburg tracks? Was he there when they were found? Did he actually find them himself? What was his involvement in the Bossburg, the Cripplefoot, for lack of a better term?
Well, when the Bossburg tracks happened in 1969, Rennie was in the Bighorn Dam area of Alberta looking into that incident. That was an Alberta classic tale of the Sasquatch, where the 15-footer was seen. He was looking into that matter, and he was contacted with John Green, said something's happened at Bossburg. And they went down there to talk to a man named Ivan Marks, who was later renowned as a great hoaxer and impersonator. As a matter of fact, anytime a researcher hoaxes over and over again, I refer to it as Ivan Marks syndrome, because he was the first example of this I ever knew. Rene went down there. A set of tracks had already been found close to the dump in the dirt by Ivan Marks. Now, this is what was a very interesting thing. He got together with Marks and said, "Let's go looking around." And I always asked Rene, "Did it seem to you that Ivan led you to the tracks?" He said, "No, I'm the one that said, let's go look here. I found the tracks in the snow by the railway line, and I drew Ivan's attention to them." So that is why the Bossburg cripple, other than the anatomy suggested by the cripple foot, I think could be real. But the fact Ivan Marks was involved puts a dark cloud over that whole thing. And like Rene said, the whole thing turned into a zoo. There were like 3 camps. You had the Rene Dahinden camp, you had the John Green camp, you had the Peter Byrne camp. They wouldn't cooperate with each other. It's almost like Ivan was almost like poor Poland in between the Germans and the Russians just before Operation Barbarossa smashed into each other. And it was a terrible thing, but it turned into a clown show, really. And whether or not and of course, Ivan started faking things involving the crypto. He faked a film that we know was hoaxed, So the fact Ivan Marks is involved in the Bossburg cripple puts that dark cloud over it. But that set of tracks that was cast by Rene, that later on Grover Krantz drew the anatomy of the skeletal feet in what he thought it should be. It was Rene always told me it was he that led Mark, that pointed those tracks out to Marks. Marks didn't know he was there. Marks was searching somewhere else. So who knows, man? It'll always be one of those. Could have been. Was it? Or was Ivan Marks playing games like he did so much? This was Ivan Marks' first example. I call it Ivan Marks syndrome because Ivan Marks syndrome is a researcher who may have been involved in something real once. It's the center of attention. But when that attention dies down, it turned out the attention was more important than the subject. So they start hoaxing to remain the center of attention. I call it Ivan Marks syndrome. And the Bossburg cripple prints was Ivan Marks' introduction into Sasquatch.
Yeah, and I've had a conversation with Jeff Meldrum on the show about those tracks and those foot castings in particular, and he seems to be sold on their authenticity. So I'm always curious about the background for that, and I appreciate you clearing that up because a lot of people don't know that information. They just hear Ivan Marks and they're like, okay, well, those are fake. But that may not be entirely accurate. If Rene Dahinden actually discovered them on his own, it's possible that Ivan Marks was faking something over here, and this may actually be a real trackway that he found. So I appreciate you clearing that up.
Yeah, the late Grover Krantz and the late John Green were also convinced of their authenticity as well. Yeah,
exactly.
Peter Byrne too, I believe. Yeah, even though Peter Byrne caught Ivan faking the film.
Exactly. I'm glad you brought that up as well. So let's shift gears a little bit. I can't have a conversation with you, I don't think, without talking about probably the biggest film out there in the Bigfoot world, the Patterson-Gimlin film. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about that. When you saw that initially, what was your reaction and where are you on the authenticity of that film today?
If the Sasquatch does indeed exist, I do believe the late Roger Patterson and my good friend for over 30 years, Bob Gimlin, filmed one October 20th, 1967. Okay? This is the camera they used that day, or one just like this, a Cine Kodak K100 with a fixed lens. You see some people with the turret lens, that's not what they had. They had this, okay? And what a horrible piece of junk this is. I mean, it's heavy, it's awkward. Roger had to use it like this. And if you look here, there's a little button, a little trigger. I don't know if you can hear that, but it's running now. And you let go of it, it almost stops on its own. Spring wound, took 100-foot rolls. And Roger's trying to hold this. There is a hole in the bottom for either a tripod or a wooden handle. But as far as Bob is concerned, they never had that. So Roger was holding like this. He's running, he's filming. And you look through the lens of this thing, it's almost looking like through a pair of binoculars backwards. It's terrible. It is awful. Matter of fact, these cameras were out. They had discontinued them in 1964, but there were still a lot of them out of there, right? And Roger rented the camera from the Shepherd's Camera Shop in Yakima, Washington. And later on, there was a warrant issued of arrest because he failed to return it on time. So Roger's pointing that, running and filming at the same time. And then later on, he had to get under a tarp and reload the camera with a second roll of film where he took a second roll of the tracks. And Roger, a lot of people don't know this, he only cast 2 tracks that day. 2. And I thought we might be talking about this, so I got a copy of the tracks right here. Oh, there you go. These are the copies of the tracks Roger Patterson cast that day, October 20, 1967. He only cast 2 of them, right? And That's it. He only cast 2. And he picked what he thought was the clearest, most distinct ones. It was Bob Titmus who went down there 9 days later and cast 10 of them in a row. And one of them he cast was this track, known as the Laverty track, which is one of the best examples of a mid-tarsal break I've ever seen. So what you got to keep in mind is whatever made this track 15 steps later. And look at the difference. When the creature's stepping out. Obviously, if someone was using cookie cutter like stompers, they all would have been the same, right? And it's continued to be the same. They weren't. That's the fascinating thing about the film that really, really intrigues me, other than the fact I've known Bob Gimlin for over 30 years now. We're close friends, and I can't believe he's been lying in my face that long. I never met Roger Patterson. He died of Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1972. I never met him. But what I've learned of him, if you were in the Yakima area back then, Roger was kind of like, you ever remember an old show called Green Acres?
Yes.
A character called Mr. Haney. Roger in Yakima was kind of like Mr. Haney. Most people knew him. Most people liked him, but they all knew, for God's sakes, don't lend him any money because he'll never get it back. That was Roger Patterson. And Roger, to me, he shot that film, and they went to Murray's Field to have it airshipped to Al Diatley, which is Roger Patterson's brother-in-law. I keep calling him his father-in-law, but he wasn't. He was his brother-in-law. And a lot of people say, where was the film developed? Well, I can tell you exactly where the film was developed. It was developed at the Ford Motion Picture Lab at 306 Fairview Avenue, Seattle, Washington. I can even give you their old phone number if you like. Okay? That's where the film is developed. And the reason I know that is a late friend of mine, Bill Miller, before he ever got involved in Sasquatch, was one of the major figures in studying this Kennedy assassination. He stopped by the Seattle Film Lab because he was looking for Kodachrome 2 8mm film because he wanted to do comparisons to the Zapruder film down in Daly Plaza. And somehow while he was in there, he was talking to this old fellow, he said, and the subject of Bigfoot came up. And he said, oh, yeah, we had that movie developed here. We showed it right there on that wall. I said, well, tell me about it. And the fellow told him. First guy came in was a businessman, had the film developed. We developed it for him, showed him on the wall. And a couple of weeks later, this little cowboy showed up to have a couple copies made, Roger Patterson. You know, and we did that for him here too. So that's where the film was developed. The Ford Motion Picture Lab at 306 Fairview Avenue, North Seattle, Washington. The building is still there. The lab has since shut its doors. There is no Kodak film producing any. I think the last one closed in Rochester, New York, just a couple of years ago. Because hey, no one buys it anymore. No one uses it anymore. It's gone extinct. But the most interesting thing to me about the Patterson-Gimlin subject in the Patterson-Gimlin film, and again, I'm only expressing my own opinion, is the IM index suggested by the figure in the film. You know what I'm talking about, the intermembrane index. A human being has an intermembrane index about 70 because our legs are much longer than our arms, right? The great apes, orangutans, gorillas, they have an intermembrane index well over 100 because they have massive arms but very small legs. The creature in the Patterson film seems to have an intermembrane index anywhere between 85 and 90. So its arms are longer compared to legs compared to human, but nowhere to the extent of the great apes. And I don't think they could have faked that. But again, I'm only expressing my opinion. Yeah. I think Sasquatch does exist. I think Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin filmed one October 20th, 1967. The Sasquatch does not exist. It never did. It's the greatest hoax ever pulled on the North American public in history. Yeah.
I definitely agree. And there's still 5 days out of 7. I think that it's real. And there's a couple of days I look at it and I'm like, hey, that could be a guy in a suit. I'm just not sure, but I tend to believe that it is a real Sasquatch caught on film. There's plenty of things. We've mentioned it a couple of times. So I definitely want to get into some of the Ivan Marks characters that may be out there. And I want to talk about a couple in particular. First and foremost, I know you've been, you've had some opinions in the past about Paul Freeman and his footage and some of his evidence. I recently had his son, Michael Freeman, on the show. He's produced a book, and Doug Hychek and Hanger One Publishing are publishing this book. I think Michael actually told me recently, just a couple of days ago, it's actually done and should be going to print. And it's basically 15 years worth of evidence and never before seen footage and some audio and video and photographs and even some casts, I think, that people haven't seen that are in this Freeman collection. Now, I know over the years you had one opinion of Paul Freeman, and I think over the years, I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm going to ask a question, has certainly changed. Now, I have seen Doug Hychek work for about 20 years on stabilizing and enhancing, and well, as enhanced as you can get that type of footage, zooming in and slowing down the Freeman footage. And I say the Freeman footage. There's a couple of films I think he's shot, but the one that's the most popular, it's about 8 or 9 minutes of this purported Sasquatch walking across the path in front of him. And I'll be honest, I've seen that footage in the past, the original stuff, and it's too grainy to make any kind of in my opinion, a real assessment of what you're seeing. I have, in fact, seen the footage. Doug and Michael sent it over to me a couple of weeks ago when I interviewed him, and I've seen what they call the enhanced version. And I have to be honest, it changed my opinion, because my opinion in the beginning was that it didn't pass the smell test, right? And what I've seen in the footage that they're going to put out here in a couple of weeks when the book comes out is what looks to be a Sasquatch, right? Walking across this path and walking over to a tree. And it looks like, to me, I'm no expert, but it looks like this thing picks up a baby, toddler, or juvenile Sasquatch, and this thing grabs onto this male or female, mom, dad, whatever, and it walks off. And that changed my opinion. I said it on the show after I put out the episode where I interviewed Michael. I believe that that's real footage. That's just my opinion. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put that out there before I ask you the question. So that said, let's talk a little bit about Paul Freeman and where you were in the beginning on the Paul Freeman footage and Paul Freeman himself, and where are you on that now?
I knew Paul Freeman. As a human being, you couldn't ask for a nicer guy. If the world were filled with Paul Freemans, the world would be a better place. He would give his shirt off his back for someone. As a human being, you can't ask for better than the late Paul Freeman. I really liked him. I wouldn't say we were associated, but I wouldn't say we were friends. We were associated because I was always hard on him. But he was a classic sufferer of what I call Ivan Mark syndrome, in my opinion. Because when he had his first encounter in 1982 as a watershed ranger, I believed him. And I defended him for a lot longer than I should have. I really thought it was a true encounter. So, you could say you can be fooled. Don't ever think you can't. But Rene told me, go talk to Adam, go talk to this guy, go talk to that guy. And I did. And I listened and I learned. And I knew that when Paul Freeman started that job, his boss said, I've had guys on this route for 15 years, never seen a thing. First time Freeman comes over, he starts the job, he's talking about nothing but Sasquatch from day one. And the first times he does this route to check on the watershed, he sees the Sasquatch. Take it for what it's worth. I don't know. Personally, the film you're talking about, in my opinion, Paul Freeman has another son named Dwayne. I think it's Dwayne in a suit myself. I think it's Dwayne in a suit. However, I have not seen this enhanced version. And however, I'm willing to be convinced I'm wrong. Freeman did go out in the bush. Maybe he did have an encounter. I don't know. But in my opinion, the Freeman footage is Freeman hoaxing. That's my opinion. But I'm willing to look at the evidence. And I saw the interview that Hychek had with his other son, Mike. Mike is his name? Yeah.
Yeah, it's Michael, yeah.
I never met Michael. I never met Michael. And Freeman shot several alleged footages of so-called Sasquatch, and also several still photographs over the years and decades ago. I think it's the same suit in all of them, quite frankly. But again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Paul did get lucky. Maybe he did have an encounter, you know, and I've just been prejudiced because of my experiences with him. I don't know. It's like I said, as a human being, you couldn't ask for nicer for some reason on this subject. Ivan Mark syndrome, and he even admitted to faking footprints in the past, and that holds on me. I mean, the last time I saw him was in a coffee shop in Seattle. I walked up to him and he said, "You're not going to interrogate me again, are you?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "Oh." Yeah. I mean, he was a great guy, human being. Couldn't ask for better. But on this subject, I don't know. Publicity does strange things to people, and he was getting a lot of publicity. You'd see him in a lot of Washington, positively Northwest shows back in the day, being interviewed and stuff. And I think I don't know, Ivan Mark syndrome. That's my opinion on the Freeman footage. Yeah. But again, maybe I'm wrong. I want to see this enhanced version and tell me why I'm wrong. Yeah.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. And like I said, I had the same opinion, honestly, about the footage. And then I saw this enhanced version that Doug worked on for quite a while. And Cliff Barackman has worked on it independently of Doug. I have not seen Cliff's version of the film, but I know what Michael and Doug sent me is, in my opinion, extraordinary. And I know there is a red herring out there. People say, well, going back to the Patterson-Gimlin film, if it was faked, very few people feel like they would have faked it using a female. They would have just done some man in a suit or whatever. But the fact that Patty has breast clearly visible, sort of adds that extra layer of impossibility to fake back then. And that's come up a couple of times since I've talked about this Freeman footage. It's kind of been rumored, it's been out there. Doug actually saw what he believed to be the baby, or this juvenile, back in the late 90s, early, I think maybe in 2000, and he pointed it out to Paul himself.
It's always been part of the film, the little feet as it dangles up when he gets his brief second, gets it on the camera shot every second time. What is this? Is it picking up a baby or whatever? Who knows what it was doing? Was it a doll?
True. And it could be, in all fairness, it could be. And that's sort of the thing that stuck with me about the film is it's either one of two things. It's either a very elaborate hoax or it's an actual Bigfoot picking up a toddler or a juvenile, whatever the case may be.
Put it this way, it's not a case of mistaken identity. It's either a hoax or it's real.
Yeah. Absolutely. There's somebody else that always comes up on the show, and my listeners are probably going to cringe when I say this, but I've heard you allude to it in the past, and it's Todd Standing, right? I've had Todd Standing on the show. I finally got him to come on because I called him out so many times for probably a year. About every other episode of my show, I was calling him out as a hoaxer, and I still do it to this day. It's similar to what sounds like the relationship that you had with Paul Freeman. Super guy. I like Todd outside of the show. He and I have become friendly outside of the show. But I come on the show every week and call him a hoaxer. I've been guest on other shows, and they say, well, that's a really tough place to be. It's kind of like hate the sin, but love the sinner kind of thing. And that's sort of the relationship I have with Todd. I personally believe that the videos that he's put out of purported Sasquatch are 100% total bullshit. I don't believe they're real. So where are you on the Todd Standing thing? Do you think he's a sufferer of the Ivan Mark syndrome?
I don't believe a word Todd Standing says. Not one word of it. I remember when he started, and what Todd forgot was I spent 25 years in the woods of Alberta before I came to the West Coast. So I went in all these areas that he allegedly says, this mysterious prehistoric valley called Savannah. You crawl through a hole in the wall and you've gone back 100,000 years to an ancient time. Oh, and you never hear him describing. He's super commando. He's JTF too. He crawled 10 miles up that river. Come on, man. And he can't keep his story straight. And we're supposed to assume he's photographed two Sasquatches. One, we call him the David Bowie Sasquatch. That's the blonde one. And the Chewbacca Sasquatch, which is the later one. And both times he got close enough to it, you could take a picture of its face, but he never got any part of the rest of it. And one point, it almost looks like he's down around its crotch, but it's looking straight ahead. It's not looking at this human down on his crotch. The stories just suck. They just suck. No, Todd Standing is a classic case in Canada of Ivan Martin syndrome today, gone mad. I don't believe a word he says. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I've called him out so many times, but I have given him the benefit of the doubt in that I do believe on some level, at least maybe a couple of times, he may have had or has had real encounters with these things. I've talked to people that go on these expeditions, they come back and they say, I saw this, I heard wood knocks, I heard this, I saw that. And they're finding what looks to be tracks. Right. Yeah. He did the same thing. He always throws the.
Well, that Stroud did an interesting, how you heard noises and said, no one knew I was there. Yeah, he did. Todd Standing, you were there. He's the one that dropped you off. He knew exactly where you were.
And that's one of the questions I've asked some of the expeditioners.
Yeah.
Is he always around? And is it possible that he's got people out in the woods making these wood knocks? And no, there's no way that, there's always a way. If a human being wants to do something like lie, like you said earlier, they're going to find a way to do it. And I'm just not convinced that what he's putting
for the longest time had one big advantage. He seemed to have money to spend on his outside. Most people don't. At least not a lot of it. Todd Standing, at least for a while before he got in, I don't know. I don't want to get into his personal life and his divorce and the fact he tried to sue the BC government, lost, and suddenly had to pay all the legal bills. You don't sue the government, lose, and say, "Oh, well, have a nice day." These lawyers got to get paid, Sparky. Yeah, that's the way it works. So he's run into trouble that way. No, to me, Ivan Mark syndrome. That's all I got to say about Todd Standing. I don't believe it says nothing.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the honest answer. I want to be respectful of your time, and we'll wrap up here in a second. Just a couple of more quick questions. When I had Peter Byrne on the show, it's been a couple of months back now. One of the things that I actually disagreed with Peter about was the fact that he was very adamant in that he did not think any of these things, and I'm talking Bigfoot, Sasquatch, existed basically east of the Rockies. And I'll be honest, one of the reasons that I started my very first show into this was to document the southeastern United States. I was born and raised in Georgia. I live in North Carolina now. And the skunk ape accounts in Florida and people seeing these things out in Tennessee. I don't know, as many times as I've documented stories that I believe these people have actually had some sort of experience, I don't think they're all lying. So where are you on the fact that these things could exist, farther east than maybe what Peter, he thinks they're isolated out west and in the Pacific Northwest specifically? Where are you on that? Do you think they could be in the southern United States and across the country?
Up until the mid-1990s, I was absolutely on Peter's side on that. Absolutely on Peter's side. I thought it was the Pacific Northwest. I grew up in the bush in northern Ontario. I never heard of a single incident until I came out here, other than cobalt and old yellow top. Maybe I thought maybe a few little areas like Falk, Arkansas, because the legend of Boggy Creek, things like that. But interviewing and getting involved with good researchers in the East, like Diane Stocking in Florida, and Ohio. I had to admit what these people were uncovering and investigating sounded pretty damn good, So no, I think it's possible the Sasquatch exists out there. If you have a wooded area that could support a population of black bears, it could support a Sasquatch or two, in my opinion. I don't think they're as common or as numerous. This is assuming the creature does exist in other areas as they are in the Pacific Northwest. Let's say the Pacific Northwest is vast. But there's actually more woodlands in northern Ontario. We're talking Canada here. It's all woods, except for the prairies. But in the United States, I kind of thought I had the same prejudice as everybody else. I think, oh, come on, sightings in New York State. What? Come on, man. What? A little patch of trees between towns? What are you talking about? Because I was thinking like Europe. But I went there and I looked myself in a couple of trips and got involved with, good researchers in the East. And I realized, hey, these patches of woods aren't little patches of woods in between towns. The towns are little dots and great big patches of woods. So why not? Why couldn't they? I mean, the winters are much bitter, and you got a lot bigger insect population there. It's never quiet at night. You got all kinds of insects going off, whereas here on the West Coast, it's dead silent unless you happen to be close to an area where there's frogs and toads. It's different. And I do believe maybe they've evolved a little differently. I mean, if you grew up in a swampy, marshy environment through generations, you're going to develop a little different than if you're in mountain country in Washington, Oregon, or British Columbia, right? So, no, I think it's possible the Sasquatch does exist elsewhere in the East as well, yes. But until the mid-1990s, I started looking into it myself, I was totally in the Peter Byrne camp. That was the Pacific Northwest. That's the whole reason I came out here from Ontario, because this is where I thought the answer was. I mean, I could have saved myself a lot of money and trips and just stayed east and looked into this, but I didn't. I wanted to get here where I thought the Sasquatch was. And then I started learning all this stuff afterwards, right? And no, today I think it's entirely possible if you got wilderness areas and you've got a black bear population, or you have a good moose population or something like that, you could have a Sasquatch.
Last question. It's kind of an odd question maybe for you, but I want to get your opinion on it because it comes up so many times. And I worked in government work for 16 years of my life, and I sort of have the inside track on what the government doesn't really know. But this vast conspiracy theory has always existed about the government knowing what Bigfoot is and covering up evidence. Where are you on that? Do you think it's something that may be more isolated that happens? Have you experienced that in the past or run across anything in your investigations that would lead you to believe that the government may be trying to cover this up and they know more than they want us to know that they know?
My personal opinion, I'm only expressing my opinion, I don't think there is any government conspiracy. No. You're talking about 2 federal governments, 9 provincial governments, 52 state governments, God knows how many county governments, city towns, all covered up. I don't buy it. Not for a minute. We're talking about a government that can't keep a secret for its life dependent on it, really. No, I don't buy that. I think the government is quite simple. They're politicians and they don't care. Until it means something financially or something, they don't care. Until science says there's something here, they don't care. They're perfectly happy to keep it in the realm of myth and mythology, and they'll keep it that way until solid evidence is found. And that's just the way it works. They don't care. Politicians are politicians. They don't care. That's my opinion. I don't think there's any government. The only example of something like that I ever had was a set of tracks that I was in Alberta at the time, and it happened in Sasquatch Provincial Park here in Harrison Hot Springs. And I was contacted by 2 people, the tenant, the camper who found the tracks, and the ranger that the camper had called over to have a look at them. They both called me independently, and neither one knew the other one called. So I called John Green, the late John Green, and the late Bob Titmus, who were still alive back then, and had them go look into it. But in the couple of hours between the time I was told about and the time they got there, the parks people had obliterated them and had done it intentionally. I always wondered why they did that, but that's what they did. Who knows? Maybe they just didn't want stories panicking or scaring people. I don't know why it was done, but that's the only example of authority covering up evidence that of alleged Sasquatch evidence that I'm personally aware of. Me, no, I don't buy it. I think politicians, they just don't care. It's not high on their priority list until science just says, yes, there's something to this. Yes, it may affect logging and money and incomes, and thus taxes, then they're not going to care.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I don't think there's a vast
No.
conspiracy on very many things, obviously, in the government, because I worked in the government, and I would say, I worked for the City of Atlanta Police Department, and we were a pretty big municipality here in the Southeast, and you would be surprised what they did not know on a regular basis about most everything that happens. And when you just multiply it out into the federal government level, and there's so many different working entities, like you said, to keep that up for so many decades and to keep things a secret doesn't really make sense. I think it's a vast conspiracy theory, and I think that's all it is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's tell everybody where they can find you. I know you do a couple of podcasts, or at least you did a couple of podcasts, and you've written some books. So tell everybody where they can find your stuff and purchase your books.
Well, my books are still available. All you got to do is my first book was called The Sasquatch in Alberta. It was published in 1989. It's kind of hard to find that anymore, but Hancock House republished that in 2018. So Hancock House Publishers basically published most of my stuff. 1993, I wrote Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the Continuing Mystery. That's also available in Hancock House Publishers. You can get it. It's usually available in most bookstores and stuff. In Search of Giants came out in 2000. That's the one I'm most proud of. And that, again, Hancock House Publishers. And since then, I've co-authored 2 other books. Meet the Sasquatch with Chris Murphy and the late John Green. That came out in 2004. And Chris Murphy and myself co-authored The Sasquatch of British Columbia, which is a chronicle of the Sasquatch mystery in the province of British Columbia from 1700 to 2012, the year that came out. And that's also Hancock House Publishers. As for podcasts, I do a monthly one that's audio only called On the Shoulders of Giants, hosted by Julie Wrench. And we interview people like we're doing here, but it's audio only, so it's not physical. And other podcasts and stuff, the Bookwash Crew with Jerry Matthews, Bill Reed, and we get together and do a show every now and then. Leon Thompson, and we discuss matters from a more zoological perspective. And we try to stay away from what I politely refer to as the inmates running the asylum.
I'm sure Leon will get into that. I'm going to have him on the show here in the next couple of weeks. Julie's been on the show. She's from my neck of the woods here in North Carolina, and I love her. And we'll definitely have links to all that stuff in the show notes. Thomas Steenburg, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It was such an honor and a pleasure to have you on. I've had a blast talking to you.
No problem, Brian. Anytime.